Like Oshaleta, Belen was near a river. Initially, it was built as an outpost along the Rio Grande as part of a defensive perimeter against Apache raiders. However, by the beginning of the century, Belen was no longer there because of the river. It was there because of the trains. A large share of its population either traveled through on trains or temporarily lived there between trains. Belen's full time resident population was 2,500 people, three-quarters of whom were Hispanic. The city hall, which George had moved there to help build, broke ground just as the Pence family arrived. That project kept George employed through much of 1937. But after that, there were only odd jobs and the lingering hope of landing a real job with the Santa Fe Railroad. That hope remained lingering due to George's growing affection for bourbon. If Thelma had felt exiled and isolated in Oshaleta, she had at least felt confident that she and her one son would always have food and shelter. Now, with five boys, and being in a place more remote and isolated than ever, that confidence felt like a fond memory. As the calendar marched through 1938, the Pence family found themselves in Belen's most affordable residence. Built as a 5 unit strip motel, it was now a dilapidated remnant of its original purpose. When they first moved in, they occupied 4 units, wishing it could have been 5. However, as the months passed without full time employment, those 4 units turned into 3 and then 2. Finally, on Thanksgiving Day, George stopped at a bar before heading home, and when he eventually arrived, he stumbled in both penniless and drunk. Now they occupied only one of those units, while 2 boys slept in the car. Still, the motel was close to the river, a benefit shared with their house on the Caney. However, here in Belen, that proximity to the river did not enhance the scenery or enrich their lifestyle. It merely meant that Thelma had less than 100 yards to walk with a number 3 tub in order to do the laundry. As hard as this life was for Thelma, those hardships mattered significantly less to the boys. They lived lives that didn't invite constant comparison with the past. With Christmas approaching, they could envision that day as a magical exception to their everyday reality. The younger ones still believed in Santa Claus, while the older ones clung to the slim hope that a gift might somehow appear. For Thelma, their hopes felt like an extra burden. She recognized that rent was unaffordable, food was too expensive, clothing was out of reach, and Christmas gifts, well, they were out of the question. Nonetheless, there was a constant discussion among the boys about what they expected for Christmas. Little George wanted a Red Ryder BB gun. Paul preferred a Buck Rogers ray gun, and Frank was convinced he'd get an erector set. Each boy expended endless energy explaining why his choice was best. And if a preference changed, it was regarded as a significant event. On Christmas Eve, these speculations became the unceasing soundtrack of Thelma's day. It ratcheted up a pressure against which she felt helpless. Reality was like a massive rock about to fall on the butterfly of impossible hope. As the day progressed, the temptation mounted for her to cry out the truth and end this senseless speculation. Doing that seemed heartless, and yet not to do that seemed equally cruel. Both choices could create an unhappy result that defied the spirit of Christmas. Thelma's dilemma had an even sharper edge because George was absent. On Christmas Eve, everything in Belen closed early, and the possibility of work vanished. Yet earlier that day he had walked out, ending the opportunity for discussion by tossing over his shoulder, "I'm looking for work. I'll be back early if there isn't any. Later, if there is." She was certain his arrival would be early if he kept his word. However, as the hours passed and afternoon arrived without sight of him, she began to suspect the true destination, a bar near the tracks on Vista Road. She decided to walk the distance to that bar for two reasons. First, she needed to escape the unending conversation about impossible gifts. Second, she was willing to enter a place she had never visited and despised for very good reason to retrieve her husband and prevent a repeat of the Thanksgiving disaster. It was a long, cold, and exhausting walk, but her husband's car was not there when she arrived. Still, she walked through the door of a place smelling of sour mash and cigarette smoke to inspect the faces of every sad sack sitting in such an ugly place. "Has George Pence been here?" she asked the bartender. Typically, his answer to an inquiring wife would be to say he knew of no such person. Yet as he took measure of the woman standing before him, he dropped his wet rag and resigned himself to a different answer. "No, I haven't seen him." Then there was a pause before he added, "Today." Thelma sensed his answer was credible. "If you see him, will you please tell him his family is waiting for him at home?" "I will," the barkeep answered with a smile that suggested he knew what was in store for George once he got home. Thelma took a few quick steps towards the door before stopping, turning around, and then saying, "By the way, everyone, have a Merry Christmas." The sad sacks and the bartender responded like an impromptu chorus. "You too." "Merry Christmas," they called out. When Thelma was back in the cold winter air, she decided to make a detour in the direction of downtown. Her pace was now less determined and her mood less resolved. She had no other options for where George might be, so she wandered aimlessly in her recess from the pressures at home. As she walked down the empty street, she could hear bells ringing from a church named Our Lady of Bethlehem, the very same name that once graced the entire town before custom decided on a shorter version. The sound of the bells and her desolate mood took her back to an earlier Christmas Eve. She remembered lying in bed but being very much awake in a house empty save for her and her one small boy. The bells rang in the distance, and like now, she felt an overwhelming sadness. The details of its source were a bit different back then, but still, it was Christmas Eve. There were bells, and she was feeling sad and helpless once again. She walked by a clothing store, closed like everything else, and saw a mannequin in the darkened window. It was wearing a simple patterned house dress labeled Cornflower Blue. Thelma was struck by the loveliness of a color she had not seen before. It was a bright, slightly purplish blue with an outsized effect, raising her up into a sky of careless joy. It was an exquisite sensation that lasted barely a moment, but the elation was real. In an earlier time, she would have acquired that dress without a second thought. Yet now, given the unlikelihood of owning it, it may as well have been made of silk instead of cotton. As reality swallowed up this moment, her imagination landed with a thud on the sidewalk. She turned away from the display window and glimpsed a distant, illuminated intersection in the encroaching darkness. She began walking toward that light, intrigued by its source and its purpose. As she approached, the sound of Christmas music gradually filled the air. The last block opened to a town square, serving as Belen's municipal center. There, in front of a bandstand, stood a creche, accompanied by a small choir singing Christmas hymns. Thelma stood with perhaps a dozen others, listening to various Christmas songs. As the last remnants of daylight faded, the small audience began to disperse, heading home to prepare for their own special Christmases. Finally, only Thelma remained. Her husband was absent. A fancy meal was not in the offing, and there were no festivities for her to prepare for. Her sole purpose for being at home was to manage her children's disappointment. It must have been incongruous for the choir. They sang their last celebratory carols with one bedraggled woman in attendance, her fists firmly planted in her pockets and tears streaming down her face. At last, the program was over, and they began to break down their music stands and put their hymnals in a bag. Shivering from the cold, Thelma stepped forward, removed a fist from her pocket, and dropped 27 cents into their red donation bucket. It was every last cent she had in the world, the total end of her resources. She put on a brave smile and once again addressed herself to a collection of strangers. "Have a Merry Christmas," she said. They looked up and responded, "You too, Merry Christmas." With that, she turned and walked into the darkness, heading for home and resuming the speed and determination with which she had left.